to title, so can I use AI for that? Because it's the type of question that I think a lot of us are posing both to our supervisors or the people that we're working with, and also kind of to ourselves. I couldn't tell you the amount of times I'm in, um, situations where I'm sitting down at my computer and I'm thinking, is what I'm about to do something that I can actually use AI for or not? And if it is, in what ways? So, what are the ethical, but also the practical ways in which I can use AI in my research? So, I'm going to start by saying that I'm hoping that this is going to be a really conversational sort of session today. I do have things that I suppose slides that I prepared that I want to talk about, but I really encourage everyone to jump in at any moment with any questions that you have. If you think something I'm saying is wildly inaccurate, please jump in and we can have a virtual fist fight about it as well. So yes, please do jump in at any time, and I might also prompt some of you to say things at times as well. Let's see if I can work this. Here we go. So why me? You might be sitting there having heard this beautiful overview that Xanthi just given and think, well, why is she the person that's talking to us about AI? And it's a very good question because on the face of it, I'm not an AI researcher. I'm not a computer scientist or a software engineer. Uh, but I thought I might give you a bit of an overview of why me. Now, I did have to write these down actually because I couldn't quite remember all of the things that I've done. But I might just have to try and remember off the top of my head. So, from a leadership perspective, there's a few ways in which I'm engaged in the AI space at the moment. I'm currently my Faculty of Fine Arts and Music at the University of Melbourne representative on the AI and Research Committee for the entire university. I'm the faculty chair of the AI and Research Committee. I am the faculty representative on the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics Committee and on the Melbourne Data Analytics Platform Committee. So I sort of have those leadership roles in relation to AI. From a teaching perspective, a couple of years ago, I was awarded a grant, what's called a FlexUp teaching grant, looking at an AI redesign of our assessment practices in a very large breadth subject that we currently have about 1,500 students in. And from a research perspective, I've recently received an AI and music research grant as well, just to put it simply. So I suppose those are sort of the reasons why I'm here speaking with you today. But I thought it was important to say that because there's a lot in this space that I genuinely know nothing about, particularly that sort of the black box part of what AI is. But what fascinates me in a lot of the meetings that I'm in speaking about AI is that it really is this playpen that we're all in, that even the AI experts don't know a lot about AI in certain contexts. So we're all coming at it with limited knowledge, with ideas, with thoughts, but this is a space that we all have a valid voice to bring to the table, regardless of what our background is. Okay, so before we go into what we will be covering today, I thought I'd quickly speak about what we won't be covering today. And there's a good reason for this. It's because when Xanthi first approached me and said, well, can you talk about AI and music psychology research? My brain went, whoa, there's about 10 different ways in which this conversation could go. There's a lot of different angles that we could cover when we're talking about AI and research in general and AI and music research specifically. So I had to kind of choose what we would talk about today and think about maybe something that I could bring to the table that might spark a slightly different conversation to one that we've had that many of us would have had already. So these are some of the things that we aren't going to speak about today. What AI is and what it isn't. But I'm going to put in my own little thought here that it's not artificial and it's definitely not intelligent. But we're not really going to go into a almost philosophical or technical conversation about what AI is. We're just going to use AI, the terminology, in a very generic way, yeah, an all-encompassing way. We're not going to look specifically at the ethical, moral, or environmental considerations on whether you should be using AI at all. Now, this is a whole other conversation, and it's a really important conversation that I'm sure many of us have had in different discussions and fora already. But the starting point that we're taking today is we're deciding to use AI. How do we use it ethically and practically? But that backward part of should you be using it at all, that's kind of a conversation for another time. The other thing, perhaps surprisingly, that we're not going to do today is talk about AI tools for music generation, like Suno AI or Udio, and also not AI tools for music analysis and annotation, like Sonatella AI. Again, the reason being that that feels like a whole other conversation. But what I wanted to focus on today was in our everyday music psychology research, regardless of what that research is, what are those more basic tools? I wanted to kind of start at the foundation, the basic tools, and what are the ways, what are the sort of the rules that we can use when we start to consider them? Now, I am going to do a quick shout out to two quite important, in my opinion, books that if you were interested in some of the questions we mentioned before, so those ethical and moral questions, and also sort of some of these AI tools that I think that you should be reading. The first is Professor Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI. It's a brilliant book, and it talks about the politics and the environmental impacts and the fact that, you know, these AI systems really are natural, as in they're using natural resources, they're using people, and people that are having to work often in really difficult situations and laborious situations to create these AI systems and all the ethical conundrums that that brings about. So again, it's a really good read. The second one that Xanthi would be able to tell us more about than I would, or I think most people would, is Mood Machine by Liz Pelly. And this one again is really speaking about Spotify, and, you know, everything around Spotify data and how Spotify works. Again, not just about AI, but there is some parts of it that speak to AI in relation to Spotify. But again, a really good read in terms of this landscape. Okay, there's one other quick thing that I just wanted to mention that we won't be speaking about today, and that's your own individual's university or institutional policy. Regardless of what we say today, I suppose the big umbrella over all of this is what your institution says that you can and can't do, or must or mustn't do, at any one particular time. So, a couple of reasons we're not going to speak about that today. One is because we're all from different institutions, some of us even from overseas. And so, every institution has its own slight variations and nuances in their policies. And two, because they tend to change pretty rapidly. So what my university, the University of Melbourne, was saying we should and shouldn't do 2 years ago is very different to a year ago, is very different to 6 months. And I happen to know that there's new policies being created now. So not something we're going to focus on today. However, there are three, I suppose, overarching rules, if you like, that we all need to adhere to. And for the moment, at least, these are non-negotiable. The first is that we must protect confidential data. What this currently means is that we should never upload confidential data into a generative AI system, such as a large language model like ChatGPT or any other. Some universities seem to have their own closed ones. At the University of Melbourne, we have Spark AI. And in some circumstances, they do mention that you can use confidential data in there. Personally, I tend to err on the side of caution and never do it, not even in the closed university ones. De-identified data is a different matter, but anything that's confidential, I simply wouldn't put into any of these systems at this current stage. My trust in that kind of fine print is fairly loose. And I'd say even outside of a research perspective, I'd really encourage you all to think quite carefully before putting any of your own personal data into there. I know we all kind of tend to want to use it as our therapist, and that seems to be one of the main ways in which these systems are currently being used, but that's something that you just need to consider. All right, second thing, review content before publication. Again, up until now, and these things may change in the future, but As of now, you are responsible for anything that is published or put out into the world. So it is always your responsibility, regardless of what we talk about now, regardless of the tools or what we do with them, to ensure that that final output for dissemination or publication has been vetted by you, and that everything in there you are willing to sign off on. So that's point number two. And as we've said, point number three, regardless of everything else, particularly if you're a student or that you're working within an institution, you must adhere to the existing academic policy, whatever that might be. All right, so that's the boring bit out of the way. What are we actually going to be focusing on today? So there's four things that I've decided for us to focus on. The first is around those tools and those rules. So we're going to have a bit of a look at some of the tools and also some of the rules in relation to using them. But it wouldn't be great to be talking about them without focusing on the risks. So we're going to do a bit of work looking at risks. If we step back from these tools and the risks and everything else around AI, often the question is, well, why are we even bothering to use them in the first place? And one of the main reasons is because of this sense of productivity, of being able to do more and do it better. So we're going to have a look at some research into whether we are actually more productive when we're using AI. And then we're going to have a look in a bit of a stepwise manner at AI and the research process. Okay, so often when I have discussions, whether it's with students that I'm supervising or colleagues, it's all about the tools and the rules. So again, going back to our initial question, so can I use AI for that? And if I can, what AI can I use and when can I use it and how do I use it? But before we think about those tools, it's really important that we step back for just a moment and start to think about risk. So before we start to talk about risk, I'd be really curious to know, just in the group, whether it's by a show of hands or whether you're comfortable, unmuting yourselves. How many people here are currently using AI in any capacity in any of the research process? Got a few hands up, and maybe a few that aren't. All right. When we start thinking about risks, have any of you decided not to use AI? So put up your hand if you were wanting to use AI for a particular task, but at the last minute you decided not to because of a particular risk. Okay, one hand. And have any of you, two hands, have any of you used AI and then after you've used it further down the track, thought to yourself, bugger, maybe I shouldn't have used AI for that because a risk has become apparent to you after you've used it? Okay, couple of you. Yeah, a few of you. So yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for participating. Risk is a really important thing. And again, as I said in the beginning, I'm not really going to go into a very detailed discussion of things like the risks of bias, for example, because again, that's quite a big conversation that we need to have. It's almost a philosophical and political conversation that we need to have. But I've decided to look at risk under the guise of two main dominant risks that we often hear about in the literature. And you'll see that some of those more risks like bias do come into these. But the two risks that I wanted us to talk to today are called commission risk and omission risk. Is anyone here in the call heard these two terms before? Or is this brand new information? I love a bit of Phoebe style, brand new information. All right, so commission risk and omission risk. Commission risk is the risk of doing harm, and omission risk is the risk of failing to help. So when we think about commission risk, it's when the system generates a hallucination, a false citation, or if we thought about it in a medical perspective, an incorrect diagnosis or dosage of a medication. And this is often the most common fear. For anyone here on the call, and there's a few of you that I know of that are involved in teaching or tutoring students at university, you'll know that commission risk, is huge, right? So we're often faced with papers where we have hallucinations in there, stuff that's just been made up, or false citations, so papers that simply don't exist. So that's commission risk, and I think we're all quite aware of what that is. Omission risk is when the system fails to include or identify critical information, and this can lead to an incomplete or misleading output. So a great example of this is, for example, when there might be things that for the human are fairly obvious, right? That we might not feed into the system, but because we have a human lived experience of something, we know that if we put certain information in, it's going to mean something else. But that the large language model or the other generative AI system simply hasn't been fed that information, and therefore it omits that really important information from its output. So again, in the sort of medical field, this can cause unsafe decisions, it can cause biased outcomes, or a faulty analysis to occur. So we've got those two types of risks. Now, large language models have been created to deal with these risks. So there are what we might term solutions. Now, I'm using solutions a bit lightly here. It's not an all-encompassing 100% solution, but there are ways that we can deal with these two risks. And again, I'm really curious to know if any of you have thought about large language models in this way. So let's first have a look at commission risk. So the solution to these commission risks is specialized RAG systems. So in the medical field, we have open evidence, and then there's a few tools there that some of you may have used before. So Elicit, Consensus, SciSpace, and Cite AI. Has anyone used any of those tools in their research? Yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised. I know, Ben, I think you have, our train buddy. So a specialized RAG system, RAG means retrieval augmentation. Who can help me out with the G? Does anyone remember? Retrieval augmentation. I'll do a quick Google because I should know this.
Generation, maybe?
Thank you. I think it is generation. Thank you. Retrieval augmentation generation. Thanks, Santhi. So what these systems do is they're architected to minimize our commission risk by constraining answers to the retrieved text that we've imported. And we're going to have a little bit more of a look at this more closely in a second. Now, omission risk is actually the ones that you're probably the most familiar with. So you've got your ChatGPT, your Gemini, and your Claude, particularly these later models, right? And they're minimizing omission risk by using what they're now terming reasoning. It's a bit of an anthropomorphic way of thinking about these LLMs. But what they do is they're connecting these really disparate data points. But what this does is it leads to a higher commission risk. So our ChatGPTs, our Geminis, and our Claudes are more likely to hallucinate and to give false citations, which is, again, these are generally the systems we tend to use, and sometimes we use them incorrectly. But our specialized RAG systems, so Elicit and Consensus, they're not going to hallucinate, but what they're not going to be able to do is reason, okay? So if we now think back to those tools, we've started to talk a little bit about the tools and the rules. And I'm going to thank one of my colleagues here at the University of Melbourne, Professor Andrew Loney, who works in the Melbourne Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences faculty here at the University of Melbourne. And he's done a lot of really amazing research, specifically in the medical field, but where he's looked at these different tools and again, tried to give us a better understanding of when and how we can use them. So if we remember again that commission versus omission risk. So in one side of the quadrant, if you like, he's looked at the tools that he calls the librarian. So this is our open evidence, our elicit, consensus, SciSpace, Cite AI. And what they do is they're prioritizing safety. So if a specific paper doesn't have the answer to your question, these tools are going to respond to you, I don't know. That information is not in the papers that you've uploaded. It's not in this retrieval augmentation generation system, this RAG system. Therefore, I don't know. Now, if any of you have used ChatGPT or other systems before, you'll know that no matter what you ask it, it's going to come up with an answer. The answer might not be correct, but it's never going to say, I don't know. It will just say, certainly, here's a response. So that's our librarian. As we've noted, it's minimizing commission risk, but it's going to maximize omission risk because it's not going to be able to give you anything novel or support any kind of complex case that you give it. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have the consultant. And the consultant is our typical ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude. These are what are called frontier models, and these later ones are our thinking models. They can synthesize across millions of tokens, sorry, that should say tokens, to find obscure patterns. So they're minimizing this omission risk. So they will, for example, in the medical fields, be able to catch rare diseases that come up. Or when you give them, hundreds and hundreds of different case studies, they're going to be able to find patterns between them. But they require this really strict, what you might have heard termed human in the loop, because they will have commission risk. There will be hallucinations, there will be made up stuff. There's going to be references that don't exist just because of the way that they work. So I find these next two slides super, super helpful in terms of thinking about the tools that I can use and when I can use them or when I should use them. Some of the things to consider. So again, this is thanks to my colleague, Professor Andrew Loney. So the first one that he did is in January of this year, he made this really handy comparative characteristics table. And I love the way that he's given each of these models a bit of like a name that we can put to them. So again, we have the librarian up above, and then he's split the next one into three different ones. So open evidence, or like we'd said before, if we're looking at something that we might find more useful for us, we have elicit, consensus, SciSpace, or Cite AI. He classifies these as the librarian. They're trusted in terms of referencing and just simply looking stuff up. Next, we have ChatGPT. He calls this the resident. Again, he's giving these a little bit of sort of these medicalized terms. They're fantastic for workflow augmentation and the logic that they bring. Gemini 3 Pro, he calls the researcher. They can do deep analysis and, in his case, genomics really well. And then Claude 4.5, he calls the communicator, because he's noted that the way in which they communicate is much more personable, and they're better for anything that requires, in his case, patient interaction, but anything where you might be, for example, writing emails, writing responses to your participants, anything where you've got that human interaction as part of the task that you're setting your LLM. So then he's given them these architectural types. So you can see here the RAG, etc. The one thing that I wanted to note is that the Gemini model is specifically good at anything multimodal. So when we think about if we're wanting to upload images, music, audio files, videos, as well as text, Gemini comes out on top. Commission risk, when we think about that commission risk. So as we saw before, open evidence, all these different types of specialized RAGs, they're the lowest in terms of commission risk, and they're actually almost zero. I mean, nothing is ever zero. You still always need to be in control, but they're really, really sort of trustworthy in terms of giving you only what you have fed into the system. So again, if the information you haven't fed it isn't in there, it will simply come back with an I don't know. And if the information is in there, it's meant to be able to spit it out as it should be finding it in there. GPT-5 has a fairly low commission risk at the moment. Again, these other models are getting better and better. If you'd asked that same question 2 years ago, the commission risk, so that hallucination risk of ChatGPT, like 3, would have been very high, right? And we know this, it would have just been spitting stuff out left and right that wasn't correct. So now that we have these new models, they are being verified by this thinking function, and you can actually see the little wheel spinning, it's thinking. But there is still a commission risk there. Gemini 3, as you see there, actually has a moderate commission risk. So it's still, in relation to the other models, quite high. And Claude 4, again, has low. So there's some more details in there. Everyone's getting these slides if you want them afterwards, so don't feel you need to be writing stuff down yet. And then omission risk, you can see it's actually a bit of a flip. So with open evidence or these other RAG systems, the omission risk isn't very high. It basically fails anything that requires some sort of novel or complex working. GPT-5, it's low. Gemini 3, however, is the lowest. So again, here Andrew has mentioned that it reads an entire patient history. What he's noticed is that he's able to not just upload results from a patient, but also x-rays and scans and blood work and all sorts of things. And Gemini 3 is able to read everything and to a really high standard. So again, thinking about the type of research we might do, if we have music analysis, if we have videos, if we have transcripts and audio files, all of that can go up into Gemini 3. Of course, as long as it's no identifiable data in there. And Gemini may be the best of these tools for us to use in that multimodal context. And then Claude, you can see there, is quite moderate in its omission risk. So this is just some research that he's done. The details aren't very important, but what I'm hoping that you might start to do is to think more about each of these models separately as perhaps being useful for a specific task. I know that what I do, and I suspect that for many of us it's the same, because this is also grounded in the psychological literature. It's a bit like when we choose a bank. And even if there are banks that give us better deals down the road, we tend to just stick with the bank, right? Because we get used to it. And I know that when I first started using LLMs, GPT was the one that I started with. And it's very difficult for me now because I'm used to the interface. It knows me, and I'm saying that with a wry smile. I've got all my workflow in there. And so going to another one feels odd. So for me as well, it's something where I'm starting to think more consistently about, I shouldn't just be jumping into my regular ChatGPT and saying, can you find me a source about this or explain this to me? It might not be the best place to do that. There are other places that I should be going, depending on the task that I want to complete. And then this is something else that Andrew said. Again, I just wanted this to be something that you could all see, this comprehensive benchmarking analysis. So again, the exact details aren't really important. But if you look at this, what he's done is he's done testing with these different language models around recall, so knowing facts, reasoning, which is applying these facts, and then novelty, which is generating new insights. So he's done these 3 tests, the test of recall, the test of clinical reasoning, and the test of novelty and complexity. And you can see just there, sort of on a snapshot, how they've all done. So again, we've got our RAG systems in that first column. It scored 100% on this test of recall. Open evidence did. Perfect retrieval of known facts. But as we flick down to the test of novelty, simply couldn't do it. It could not solve a novel problem. But then as we go across, you can see that ChatGPT 5.2 had a pretty good test of recall, but it was probabilistic. And then you can see how the others scored. So Claude there, not quite so good. But then reasoning, we've got a bit of a mixed bag there as well. Strong multimodal reasoning. So again, in that Gemini, we can see that multimodal reasoning coming through strong. And then the test of novelty, interestingly, none of them did really well at all. So again, something that we need to think about. Even Gemini 3, which is the current state of the art for complex synthesis, still below 50%. That's what it's hitting on this test of novelty and complexity. So in terms of this reasoning, they sound really, really good. If you were to read the outputs from these tests, you might think to yourself, gosh, it's doing amazingly well. This sounds beautifully reasoned. But the reality is that they're not actually all that good. Again, this is where we currently are. Who knows what they'll be in the future? But for now, this is sort of the lay of the land. It was funny actually doing this talk. I thought it's sometimes we present presentations and you think this is going to have a good shelf life. I'm doing this presentation and in 6 months or in 2 years, I could go back and still use that presentation for something else. This is the kind of presentation that we might look back on in 6 months or a year and think, wow, this is outdated. But anyway, this is where we are now, so we'll use it. So I hope that that was perhaps, before we move on to the next bit, a bit of an interesting overview of some of these different, tools that we have. I'd be curious to know if anyone here on the call has used all of those. So you've used a RAG system before, regardless of which one, and you've used GPT and Claude and Gemini. Has anyone here, could they put their hand up and say, yep, I've used all four of those different systems for different parts of my research? No, maybe no one. So again, maybe one of the first things that all of you can do when this call is over, or even now in the background, is to go and have a play around with some of these, if you feel comfortable doing so, of course. All of this is within your own comfort. Okay, so we talked about risks and we've talked about these different tools, but there is one other risk that I wanted to briefly mention. And that's a bit of an unusual risk, but it's the risk of not using AI, which is a bit of a weird way of thinking about it. There's a lot of risks inherent with using AI, but now that AI is really everywhere and everyone seems to be using it, what are the risks of not using it? So there's just a couple that I wanted us to have a really quick look at today. The first is what's called reduced analytical capability, and the second is decreased efficiency. So, what can AI do? Well, one of its sort of hallmarks is that it can analyze vast amounts of data and identify patterns that human analysis might miss. Now, again, you can see that a lot of these slides have a bit of an almost medical slant to them, and it's because the medical fields are really racing ahead with AI, and for some very, very good reasons. I had a colleague of mine that was talking about the fact that in Melbourne, I think in Victoria actually, there are something like 14,000 patients that are waiting for a particular type of surgery. So they're on waiting lists. And it can take months and months, if not years, before they find out whether they even need the surgery. So what happens is they get all of these tests done, they go up to a certain qualified doctor, and the doctor then has to go through and say, yes, you do, no, you don't, etc. So these patients are waiting for a very long period of time, and it's incredibly expensive on the healthcare system to get them their diagnosis and whether they need this surgery. So what one of the hospitals here did is they put these 14,000 patients' data into a specifically designed generative AI system. I don't know what it was exactly. And they set it up and they, did everything they need to do in the back end. And within 2 hours, it had come up, I think, with a list of like 200 patients that needed surgery. So it was able to, in a couple of hours, and I think it cost them, they calculated like $100 to do this. It just saved hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. But more importantly, for these patients, they were then able to get a response very quickly. And those who did need surgery are now able to go through the system much quicker. So this is one of those really good positive case studies of when our AI can be super, super useful. I'm thinking about music psychology. And when I think about vast amounts of data, it's difficult to go beyond something like Spotify. So when we think about the huge amounts of data that a system like Spotify or Apple Music or anything else has, or even things like social media posts. And if we think about the amount of social media posts that might be focusing on music and well-being or mental health or anything, there is so much data that for an individual to be able to trawl through that or to make a meaningful dent in it is almost impossible. But there are AI systems that we could use to be able to support that. So that's one of the risks of not using AI, is that we may not be able to do that type of data of research. And then, of course, there is the typical response to this, which is that without using AI, things like manual literature reviews, data processing, and drafting take far longer. So if we don't use them, we might produce less comprehensive and lower impact studies. So whereas as an individual, I might be able to do a study with a certain number of papers or a certain number of participants, by using AI, I'm going to increase the impact of the research that I'm able to do. Okay, so we've looked at the tools and some rules, and we've looked at a few of the risks. Before I jump off that little bit about increased efficiency into our next section, does anyone at this stage have any questions, comments, anything else? Do I keep going on? Okay. All right. So the slippery slope. We have all jumped onto AI before, and we found ourselves in a situation where we might start the first tentative little thing that we do is something pretty basic, pretty boring, and actually something that we really have no need to do. I'm thinking something really administrative, okay? And AI is able to do it immediately, and you think, gosh, that was brilliant, and it saved me, half an hour of my time doing this small menial task. Brilliant, great. Not too many ethical issues with it. You're just very happy doing it, and off you go. Next day comes along, and maybe you ask it to do something a bit more, and then a bit more, and a bit more. And before you know it, you've basically gone, oh, I've got half an hour to hand in my abstract. Can you just write me my abstract? Sure, that'll do. Fine, chuck it in. And you haven't really read it over and you don't really know what it says, but it sounds kind of all right. And it's only after that you go back and go, ooh, there's a few words in there that I would never have used, and they don't actually speak to what I was thinking. So that's the slippery slope that we can get on, that we start really high up, if you like, on this slope, and then we slowly go down. Now, there's a fantastic article in the New Yorker called The End of the English Paper. And it's a journalist who is speaking to university students about their use of generative AI. And it speaks about this. So it's a great paper to read. Okay, so the productivity fallacy. I'm going to assume that one of the main reasons why all of us are interested in using AI is because it makes us more productive. So we think. And there's a few elements to this. I know for myself that one of the productivity hacks that AI is really useful for is getting over that thing that we call writer's block. Or if I'm not feeling competent in a task. So it's that imposter syndrome. And I genuinely find that it helps. So that's the scenario where I'm sitting at my computer. My wonderful supervisor, Professor Gary McPherson, has just gone, oh, can you write a chapter for this new handbook that I'm publishing? Because he's always writing a new wonderful Oxford handbook of something or the other. And you go, yeah, sounds brilliant, because what he's asked you to do sounds vaguely like something that I can do. And then I sit down in front of a blank page, starting this process that I've put off for about 3 months because it was a big piece of work and I didn't really feel confident doing it. And I think, bugger, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. Why has he asked me to do this? I'm not the best at doing this. There are tens of thousands of people better at writing this than me. I don't know what to do. So I find that ChatGPT, which is the one that I've typically used, can be really, really good at two things. One is just giving me a general structure. So I've been asked to write this chapter. What should I do? And again, because ChatGPT knows me quite well, it might say, well, your expertise in this, you could write this, this, and this, how you'd structure it. Typically, what happens at this point is I plop that into a Word document and I think, that's a bit crap. I could do better than that. And I refine it and I change it, and then off I go on my merry way. The other lovely thing about ChatGPT is it's generally incredibly positive. It talks about my expertise and how I'm a world leader in this, that, and the other, and how I'm wonderful and what an impactful chapter this is going to be. And it makes me feel brilliant. So off I go and I'm on a roll, and it really helps with that. Okay, that being said, the research that the Harvard Business School have done, amongst others, shows that AI does not seem to reduce work and does not make us more productive, that it's an illusion of productivity. I was recently in a seminar, again, as part of this AI and research working group that I'm a part of. And the Australian government has recently put up a productivity commission, of which I was one of the members who wrote the University of Melbourne's response to the government's AI and productivity commission. And there appears to be literally no research that we can find in the world that demonstrates that AI is making an area more productive, except for mining. So take that the way you want to take it. So it doesn't reduce work, but it does intensify it. And there are three main forms of intensification. The first is that it expands your tasks. What this means is that in the past, I would have had a really good sense of what I was able and not able to do. So there are certain tasks that I can do, and then other things that I'm not so great at. So, for example, I'm not great at statistics, but I know that Amanda, who's on the call here, is brilliant at statistics. So, if I had a research project that involved statistics, what would likely happen is that Amanda and I would collaborate. And we would have fairly, understood boundaries of what I would be doing and what she would be doing. And we would collaborate together. What happens now is that I can go into ChatGPT, into Claude, into Gemini, and I can say, write me some code, write me the R script, do the statistical analysis, and it's going to spit me out something beautiful that may or may not be entirely correct. But it's going to give me the sense of being competent to do that task. So whereas before I would stick to my lane and do the tasks I knew, I know, what the research is showing is that people are now doing more and more tasks that they previously wouldn't have done. So we're expanding our tasks. The second part is that it's blurring boundaries between work and non-work. So what happens at the moment is that it's a bit of a social media effect, a scrolling effect, in that people tend to have ChatGPT on and they'll say, oh, it's my lunch break, but I'm just going to prompt it to do something in the background while I'm having lunch. Can you do this? Can you do that? And so people are starting to bleed into their non-work time because it's a little bit gamified, because it's a little bit fun, and because the generative AI is giving you often these really positive reinforcements, we don't see it as work so much, but it is work and it's starting to bleed into our time. So we're spending more time at work than we were before. And then the other one is more multitasking. So people are starting in many businesses to have 2 or 3 AI systems going on in the background. And one of them's running code here, another one's looking something up, another one's writing this, and you're doing something else on the side, and then an email comes and, oh, can you reply to this email? And off you go. And this multitasking is creating a cognitive load. So what we're doing is we're sort of dipping into these things one by one, and not really having a sense of any of them. So these are the 3 ways in which our work is becoming more intense because of generative AI, and it's not reducing it or making us more productive. So there are 3 main considerations to bring here. The first is to have intentional pauses. If you are using a large language model, it's really important that if it's supporting you with any of the tasks that you're doing, that you stop, you pause, you read, you reflect, you walk away from the computer, you do something that takes you away from simply just saying, okay, can you refine it? Okay, can you give me more? Okay, okay, okay. The second one is you sequence things. Don't give it a big, massive task to do at once, which has multiple steps in it. Try to prompt your systems in a way where it's one minor task at a time so that you then have oversight to go in, which is number three, human grounding, to go in and to think really carefully and critically. That one thing that I asked it to do, that small step, is it what I would have done? Is this correct? What is it missing? How can I modify it or change it? And in doing this, it's going to be more valuable to us. So this is a lovely quote that I found in this paper. So the AI doesn't reduce work, it intensifies it. Beyond perspective, social exchange supports creativity. AI provides a single synthesized perspective, but creative insight depends on exposure to multiple human viewpoints. This is really important. What AI is doing is giving us that synthesized perspective, but that's not how we as researchers function. So, what they were suggesting is that we need to institutionalize time and space, both for listening and dialogue. And in this way, an organization, but we can think of ourselves as an organization, as a collective of people. We need to re anchor our work in that social context. So, literally speaking to other humans, getting other opinions, finding advice. And in this way, we're going to help counter that depleting, individualizing effect of that fast AI mediated work. And you can see that I really focused on those two concepts of time and space, giving ourselves time. You know, we often, when we think about AI, we're often told AI is going to do all the boring stuff, so we have more time to think. But I don't see myself stepping away from the computer more often and going, brilliant, AI's just done something for me. Now I've got time to go for a walk under a tree and just think. I don't do it more, and I need to do it more. I don't give myself the space to think, and I don't give myself the time to think. And that's what AI is meant to be giving us. So I very cheekily called this Einsteining my AI because Einstein is all about time and space. So I'm going to encourage all of you to Einstein your AI. If you're using your AI, you have to find time and space away from it to be able to use it effectively. Now, as usual, I've blabbered on for far longer than I thought I was going to. So you'll remember that the last part of this discussion was around the research process. And I'd actually come up with a bit of so there's a sort of a typical research process diagram that I just got off the internet when we move from defining the problem all the way to disseminating the results. And I was going to play a bit of AI ethics bingo with you all, but we're not going to have time. So what I'm going to do is to stop sharing my screen now. You'll see there's my little AI ethics bingo, and we can do that at another time. But given that we've only got a few minutes left, I'd be really, really keen to make sure that we open the discussion up for questions, conversation, concerns that some of you might have.
Thank you so much, Solange. That was super interesting. Um, would anyone like to start us off with the first question?
And you are allowed to get AI to write the questions for you. You just have to make sure that you're verifying them yourself, yeah?
I don't know if this is a question or just a thought, but I have not really been using AI for writing. Until very recently in my head that was a like it's writing, I have to produce my own, and not that I'm not producing my own writing now, but I mean like there's a distinction there. But I had someone tell me that I should be doing that. And I did, I put something through it, and the advice was like it can help maybe with like structuring something to get it like perfect. And I did that, but there were like two key things that I found kind of weird in the process. One was the it's suggesting phrases and words to me, and I'm like now reading back over it. I'm like, I've integrated this particular word a lot, and now it's starting to read AI to me, and I don't know how much of that is because I'm not copying chunks, but I'm using its suggestions or that kind of thing. So like losing some of your own writing style, I think. That was the second point. I forgot what it was. But in terms of risks, that's what I was thinking of when you were talking about like risks. Oh, the second
Mhm.
thing was that, yeah, it's always like, this is so great. You're like in such a good position with this piece of writing. And I'm like, thanks, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the positive can be helpful at certain parts of the process and unhelpful at others. Um, it's interesting. There was an article that was published recently. I'll have to try and find it. And they were looking at creativity. So what they did is they got a certain number of people. So, they did sort of typical written creativity tests. And then they got some people to use ChatGPT across an amount of time and then others to not. And what they found was that not only did so initially, the people who used ChatGPT did better with the ChatGPT system at the creativity test, right? So it gives you this almost false sense of you're becoming more creative. But then what they did is they got them to use ChatGPT for quite a long series of time. I think it was a month. And then they tested them directly after that month and asked them not to use it again. And then a month later, and they scored worse on both times, even a month after stopping using it, than their colleagues who hadn't used it in the first place. And what the paper was suggesting was that we're starting to become almost desensitized to other thought that isn't this flatlined AI speak. So when we use AI through our writing, exactly like what you're saying, you start to sound like the AI, but more than that, it's that actually you're almost incapable of pulling yourself out of that AI speak because you've become so used to it. So that is a real risk. And when we talk about author voice, this is something that's really important. So, I'm thinking about the sort of reciprocal feedback model. I'm trying to bring in the music psychologist here, and you've got the person, the music, and then the context that it's in. And I think with all of this, you've got the person who you are, you've got the music, which is like the tool that you're using, and then the context of what it is. So if I was asked to, I mean, a great example is something like, every year we have to write um, what do you call it? Like what's called a PDR, like a professional development review for the university. Okay.
That's the first
So
thing I got
boring.
used for.
There we go. See, it's so boring. It is such a waste of time. And I really just like having to, plump myself up with, oh, I'm wonderful. And here's all the stuff I've done. And it's amazing. And all it is just going into a spreadsheet of everything I've done and putting it into fancy words, into different categories and off you go. Brilliant. Because the context of that is, I don't care. It doesn't matter what it sounds like. The university just wants to know I'm doing my job, spit it out. Fine. Great. If it's something, though, where the context is that I'm communicating with other people and the story I'm telling is important and any of our research is important, then we really need to be careful about what we're using it for. So again, different tools, different contexts, and different people. I just think, marrying those up together is really, really important. And exactly that, like, what is the risk? What is and this, again, this is a whole other talk that we could have done as well. What are the risks to a early career researcher or to a graduate researcher who in particular? So these are people who are learning research skills. There's a different set of risks for you as a cohort than there would be for a seasoned professor who it might be actually less problematic to get an AI overview, a quick abstract of a paper, because in their mind, they already have the decades and decades of music research already in there. And so a quick overview might help them and they can very quickly decide or understand what bits they need to learn more about or move into. But for a graduate researcher, it's going to be much more difficult to do that.
I've got a couple of questions. Would anyone like to go before me?
Go for it, Xanthi.
Okay. Um, I'm wondering where AI has been most helpful or most ethical in your research process, because I've seen some recent research on the different stages, like the idea development, then writing up the ideas, and then revision. And a lot of people seem to like the idea generation phase because they can then edit the ideas, make it their own, and then write it up in their own voice.
Mm,
Whereas others prefer the revision stage. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then also
yeah.
how you think AI will change academic research over the next 10 years.
No. So just a small question, yeah? Yeah.
Yeah.
So to your first one, I might do that boringly cheeky thing of reframe it a little bit. I think helpful is I think it's the wrong question that we often ask. So again, this moves us into the productivity space, yeah? Where is it more helpful? If helpful means doing stuff quickly, then there's a lot of help that it can give us. But I'm thinking about Diana's question. But if the idea of this was just churn out more papers and churn them out quicker, it can be incredibly helpful. Yeah, yeah. I could if you set me a task and said write a 6,000 word paper by midnight tonight, I could probably do it and get it published like to a publishable level. Um, you know, and that would be something I could do. Any of us could do it. It's not a me thing. Any of us could do that, and probably on a topic we didn't know all that much about, to be honest. Um, but for me, it's more about where is the joy, and where has the joy gone out of what I meant to do, and how can this support me getting that joy back? So you were just talking about ideas generation. I can't think of much more fun in what we do than coming up with ideas. you know but how do we come up with my ideas? Again, I mentioned certain people. There are people like Ben and Margaret that I work with all the time. There are people like Amanda, Sabrina, that I work with, and I love sitting down, having conversations, and what if we did that? Oh, that's reminded me of that. And we have a laugh and we talk about things and we come up with stupid titles for papers we'll never write. That's the joy in what we do. I don't want AI to do that for me. It would be good at it probably, but I don't want it to do it. But as I mentioned before, some of the stuff that I don't enjoy is the pressure. It's the pressure to have to perform. It's you have a paper that's due. You've got your stupid PDF that's due. There are things that are due and I have to do them, or they're administrative. And in those contexts, AI can be really useful and helpful because one, it can take off a burden of something that I have to do, but is almost analogously performed by a machine. Um, but also, there are instances, I think I mentioned, like those sort of imposter syndrome, or at least I suffer from a lot of procrastination. And that idea of it gets you over that first little, I can't do this, it's too big, or just breaking things down. Another example is so again, I had a book chapter again that Gary had asked me to write. This was 7 years ago or something, so pre LLMs that we could use. And after a couple of months of sitting on it, I wrote back to Gary and I said, Gary, I don't know how to structure this. It was a chapter that he and I were writing together, but I was first authoring. So it's just that little bit outside my wheelhouse. I don't really know what to do. I'm floundering. And in true Gary fashion, in a couple of hours, he'd sent me back an email and he went, this is the structure I think we should have. Boom, 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 boom. And that was it. That is all I needed to go from I can't do this to going, oh, cool. Well, I'll start with that section. I'll then do this section, and off I went. So ChatGPT can do something very similar. It can be my Gary in my pocket when I don't have Gary there to go, you've got this, here's a structure, and I can just use it. So there's another example. Where are we going to be in 10 years' time? How long is a piece of string? But it could be anything from, I don't think AI is going away. So I'm not one of those people who thinks that it's just a bit of a phase, and in a few years we'll all forget and we've spoken about it. I don't think that's the case. It's incredibly political. So, for example, I don't think ChatGPT is going to be around for many more years. For example, I don't think that our university is going to be subscribing to something like ChatGPT for very long either. Again, because of the political um, concerns and tensions that there are at the moment with some of these LLMs. Well, some of the companies that have them. Um, I suspect that it's going to change all of our workflows, all of our training modules, everything that we do, to the point where if we look at the other end of the spectrum, it's possible that things like universities won't exist anymore and that researchers won't exist anymore in the way that we currently see ourselves. So these are really important questions to be asking ourselves, because how we currently define our jobs is unlikely to be what they are in 10 years' time. Now, like anything, that's really scary because we define ourselves by what we are to a large degree, and it's a huge part of our identities and these skill sets that we have. But, it's also an opportunity. And currently, again, when we look at all of the advice, they all say that we still need humans in the loop. That may or may not be the case. I'd be just as, happy to bet money that, yeah, universities as we currently know them no longer exist, as it would be to say that we become even more important than we are now, but just for very different reasons.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting to see what happens in the future. I've heard some AI theorists talk about how our work days may be shortened,
Mhm.
uh, or that it will be hard to find work because we're so efficient with the use of AI, and we'll have all this free time to support the arts industry. Um,
Sure. But again, look at the evidence. Again, this is just now, and in 2 years or in 4 years or 6 years, it might be very different. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a productivity gain, and we aren't becoming more efficient. And I mean, you can ask anyone on this call or somewhere else. I don't know anyone who sits back and goes, gee, I've got a lot of free time now. Isn't this great? So, yeah, not convinced by that argument. But tell you what a time to live in, hey? You read books, history books, and this is definitely, in my opinion, a moment in history that we are currently living through.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up the seminar. And I just want to thank you so much, Solange, for this really timely and interesting discussion. I know I've learnt so much, and I'll be practicing Einstein in my AI from now on. So if everyone can please join me in giving Solange a round of applause. We really thank you for your time today.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Lovely to see you all here.
Thanks, everyone.